And today we're going to talk about walking the trigger. I've gotten about 30 straight emails, it seemed like, about how to walk the trigger, what's the best way to walk the trigger. You know, my field only allows semi-autos, so I need practice. How do I practice walking the trigger? So I'm going to try to share with you my way of walking the trigger. Now, everybody's got their own way of doing it. I'm going to show you my way. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that you need to pick a trigger on if your field is only allowed for semi-auto play. There's a lot of guns that are made just for PSP play, where your trigger doesn't matter, the trigger geometry doesn't matter, how the trigger's designed doesn't even matter, because in PSP this is all you need to do to be able to shoot 15 balls per second in PSP. Just pop, 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 pop. That's it. That's all you got to do to be able to shoot 15 balls per second in PSP. You can do it like this. You can do it like this. You're going to be able to shoot 15 balls per second in PSP doing it that way. But if your field only allows semi-auto, and if you want to get good at semi-auto, the first thing you need to do is you need to find guns that have good trigger geometry. Now, a long time ago on my Mikey USF channel, I talked about triggers with good trigger geometry and what you have to do to look for a trigger with good geometry. So we're going to re-explore that. I'm going to tell you that for triggers, the pivot point for triggers, I'm going to try to draw this out really quick. Okay? On a good trigger that is set up properly, the pivot point should be in the back and the trigger should come down like this. Okay? There's the hole. Here's the micro switch, here's the micro switch. This is the best kind of trigger that I've seen for walking the trigger, okay? The pivot point is in the back, the trigger is in the front, and this works the best for walking the trigger. The ones that usually are the worst for walking the trigger are the ones where the hole is on top and the trigger drops straight down, and then you've got your pivot, your adjustment screws. Kind of like the Proto, the Shocker's another good example of this. Also the new SMG, the Rail, is a good example of this. Planet Eclipse does a pretty good job of hiding it because they have the Sith design, but these are any sort of trigger where the pivot point is behind the trigger is the ones that are the best ones for walking. I'll tell you what my personal favorite guns are for walking the trigger. Planet Eclipse does a great job because their triggers are kind of swoop, so it allows you to get on it pretty easy. The Alias Intimidator, by far, almost without a doubt that I've seen, the Alias Intimidator and also the Generation 4 and even the Generation 2 had the best trigger design for semi-auto play. You can just mow with those guns in semi-auto. Easily some of the best triggers. Now, the new Dye Ultralight, coincidentally, the Dye Ultralight frames that are now coming on all of them, looks a lot like the Alias trigger in many ways. The bearing is recessed back, and let me show you why that's important. Okay, when you're shooting your gun, you're not shooting your gun like a rifle with your arm outstretched, okay? Your hand is not like this when you're shooting a paintball gun. It's not straight back like a rifle. If it was, you'd have the gun at arm's length. Your hand is cocked down at a 45-degree angle to your bottle. Okay, so when you're holding, so you see the plane that your knuckles are going to be is going to be at a 45-degree angle basically on your gun. Okay, so by having a trigger that accentuates that the geometry is designed for that, kind of like the Legend Infinity. That's a great example of a semi-auto trigger. Okay, that's designed for HK. Obviously, HK plays MPPL semi-auto, and that trigger goes down at a 45-degree angle. The trigger is where the pivot point is in the front. When you're out there and you're shooting, your hand has to be almost directly behind it like this, but your knuckles should match the plane of the trigger. Okay. And the reason why that's important is because the top finger, it's going to be just as easy to pull the trigger at the top finger as it is for the bottom finger. So by having the plane of the trigger match how your knuckles are aligned by you holding your gun, it allows you to, the same amount of tension to pull the trigger at the top is the same amount of tension to pull the trigger at the bottom. Bob Long is a fanatic about this. So is Dave Youngblood. Planet Eclipse is doing a great job also. Some of the other guns that are out there, like the Proto, the Smart Parts guns, worst trigger in paintball, easily the worst trigger in paintball. But that's the first thing when you're setting up for semi-auto play, is getting a gun that has the correct trigger geometry. The SLG, don't even try it. The Matrix Rail, don't even try it. Okay, they're great guns, but they are not designed for semi-auto play. Now, The next thing I'll talk about after you pick a gun that's good for semi-auto play. My personal favorites: Planet Eclipse, Bob Long and Die, the Ultralight Flames. Any of the Bob Long guns always have amazing triggers. The next thing that you do when you're walking the trigger, the number one problem that I see a lot of people do is when they go to walk the trigger, they hold the trigger back as the next finger touches it. So basically the trigger never gets completely off the micro switch. Instead of hitting it like this, where they're letting it go, next finger hits it, lets it go, next finger hits it, lets it go. What a lot of times happen is they depress the trigger and the next finger hits the trigger before the first one lets go. So the trigger always stays back. Now, one of the ways to combat this, now the best way that I've seen to combat this is to, when you're pulling the trigger, is to hit your trigger frame with your fingers when you first start out. So I know a lot of people like to stick their fingers out. There's a couple different ways that I've seen people try to block the triggers. I'm going to tell you my favorite way. Some people do the eagle, I don't know what they call it. It's like an eagle talon grip. Okay, they use just the tips of their fingernails. Dynasty does this. You notice Dynasty always does this because there's no other way to walk that trigger. You'll see their fingertips stick out like this and then curl back. I have not found this to be a very fast way of walking the trigger at all. Some other people also, they'll look at it and you'll see them stick their hand all the way out to here and then go like this. Okay, that's not practical for playing real paintball. The best way that I've seen to walk the trigger is not to use the tips of your fingertips, but to use the undersides of your knuckles right there. So the two the underside of your knuckles. Use that to hit your trigger. So your fingers go all the way through the trigger frame. Okay, your fingers go all the way through the trigger frame, and you're using the inside of your fingers down there at the first knuckle to walk the trigger. I found this to be the fastest way of walking the trigger, and also when you're aiming at somebody, it's less of a profile than sticking your knuckles out like this and trying to walk the trigger, or sticking your wrist out like this and trying to walk the trigger. By having your fingers inside of the trigger frame makes it a lot faster. Now, like I said, the number one common mistake of walking the trigger is holding the trigger down with the first finger while you pull it, try to hit it with the second, so the finger never comes out. By going and having your fingertips hit the trigger guard, so you're pulling so far away from the trigger that you're hitting the trigger guard and then coming back, you're going to really speed up your trigger play. So what I like to do is I like to feel the trigger guard hitting my fingernails as I'm walking when I first start out. Now, once you get the hang of not doing the hold the trigger back and then touch it with the next finger, the common mistake, once you get at it, then you can stop hitting the guard and then come off the guard a little bit to where you're just getting on the trigger without hitting the guard. But that's the number one common mistake on why people can't walk their trigger, is because their fingers are holding the trigger back and never coming off. So it's just like so the fingers are wiggling, but they're not really pulling the trigger. So try that if you're having a hard time walking the trigger. Try pulling the trigger, and when you come off, hit the trigger guard. Pull the trigger, hit the trigger guard. Pull the trigger, hit the trigger guard. Now get your other finger in there. Pull the trigger, hit the trigger guard. Pull the trigger, hit the trigger guard. And then start doing it like that. And then you can start practicing and getting it faster and faster and faster. And soon, after with enough practice, you shouldn't have to hit the trigger guard, because you're gonna feel your fingers coming off of the trigger when you're pulling it. So that's probably the best way I can tell you to pull the trigger when you're out there shooting it. You can dry fire your gun. Usually doesn't hurt it, but obviously you're going to run out of air. But in my opinion, that's the best way to walk the trigger. Stick your fingers through the trigger guard, hit it with the undersides of the first knuckle right there, and I found that that's a very, very comfortable and a very fast way of pulling the trigger. So hopefully this helps. Helps you guys walk the trigger a little bit more, and get up your rate of fire a little bit faster. Thanks for tuning in.